let's realize these are just outlines at this point. We haven't done any shading. We haven't played with the light at all except in recording.
Hi everyone, I'm Gary Tucker and welcome to my channel. I present weekly demonstrations on painting with watercolor. Many of you have asked how you can support this channel, take a workshop, or attend a class in person. I would refer you to the description below. There you will find information on today's subject, ways to support the free content on this channel, and links to other important resources.
Okay, we're going to start with a exercise on seeing our subject in terms of angles, in terms of edges, shapes, edges, angles, and some of these angles we call invisibles because they're sort of a crutch or a construct that we create to be able to render our subject more accurately. Let's start with our most simple object up there, which is the large grapefruit. We'll do a little circle here. And this is representative of many fruits, an orange, a tangerine, with some slight variations. In fact, the grapefruit too has some slight variations. When it's whole like this, we see it as a circular shape. And within that circular shape, yes, there are some little variations. The bottom tends to be a little flat. The sides tend to be a little boxy with the grapefruit. The top tends to have a bit of a conical shape. And there's always a little navel. So our perception starts with the circle. And once we get the circle about the shape that we want, we can move it around, we can adjust it, and we can do this sort of individual sort of shaping of that circle to make it look more like a grapefruit. So this is our simplest object up there. And let's look at the shadow that's coming off of it. The shadow that's coming off of it is because our angle of our light is coming this direction. It's casting a shadow towards the back. The shadow is also a circle, but it's officially it's called an ellipse, but it's basically a flattened circle. The plane of the grapefruit is kind of straight up and down, whereas the plane of the shadow, from our perspective, is laying down. This helps to describe the angle of the light, as I am illustrating here. It's also helping to illustrate the flatness of the table. Let's imagine, or we can kind of observe quickly, if we're looking down on our subject. I think this might make the idea of the ellipse a little more clear. So we draw the grapefruit that doesn't change that much. Perhaps the navel comes in a little more. But basically we see this large round shape. But if we look down on it from above, the angle of the table, the flat surface of the table, is changed quite a bit, so that the angle of even though, well, now the light is kind of coming this direction, but look at how much it changes the shadow shape. These minor changes or major changes, these changes to our shapes greatly define how we are in relation to our subject. If we're sitting eye level with our table, the grapefruit is roughly going to look the same. I should put this I'll just overlap this. Grapefruit will look roughly the same, that circular shape, and the shadow is almost just going to be a line. This is if we're looking at it from eye level. In other words, if my table were raised up to my eye level, then that affects the shape of the shadow greatly. It does not affect the shape of the grapefruit overly much. It still remains a circle, but it really varies the shape of the shadow. Okay, let me erase these. We're going to do a couple more things here to get you familiar with looking at your subject, seeing it in simple terms, and understanding how that subject moves in space and being able to communicate that are some of the things that are challenging when we're first starting to see the world as an artist. Let's look at the grapefruit again. You notice that I have a couple halves, one half leaning against another. So if we look straight down on our grapefruit half, again, it's going to look like a circle, right? A circle. If we look at it from above, like we're seeing it now, that circle becomes an ellipse. The circle becomes distorted, and it becomes more elliptical. Let's draw this. And we'll draw the bottom part, which remains sort of a circle. It's basically half of this. So here's our half of a grapefruit. And we have another grapefruit leaning against it. This is at a bit of an angle, but it's more open, more visible than this one. So 1, 2, 3 variations of that same circular shape. This circular shape is pinched. That's why we call it an ellipse. Let's see, it's got to come a little lower here to be accurate. Restate that. Bottom leaning against grapefruit behind. And I'll erase this. We don't need that. And we don't need this as well to make the illusion complete. So I hope this is clear. This part is also being hidden by the grapefruit, so we can erase that. So we call this foreshortening, where things are distorted because we're looking at them at a particular angle. We're seeing them the length of this subject, or we're seeing it askew at a certain angle. This is all a distortion of the main shape of the circle, and that distortion has a term called foreshortening. We use it a lot. I mean, the term is just a term, but it describes a very common sort of phenomena that we deal with as visual artists. Okay, there's a little shadow coming off here, and there's a shadow coming off here. Always draw in those shadows. Those shadows are so important, as we'll come to see. So we have the main grapefruit standing back there. We have two halves as represented by this leaning half and this upright half. A particular note is the angle of the ellipse. There's an invisible angle that we use for the ellipse. That's what I mean by an invisible. It's sort of an angle that helps us to establish the lean or the direction of a piece of fruit, cut piece of fruit, as we see here. And this becomes important in setting up the basic relationships when you're just getting started with the drawing. Perhaps we can see that in the lemons as well. Let's do some quick studies of our lemon. If we're looking at the lemon, for example, straight on, here's the navel, here's the lemon. We're looking right straight on at that lemon. So it's basically, again, a circular shape, and we'll put a little shadow coming off. If we turn that lemon a little bit, it starts to become a little more oblong. We start to see a little more of the navel. We start to see a little bit of that back navel. We look for the axis, the invisible, that this resides on to help us establish that. And we'll do one more version where we see the profile. The profile of the lemon. So you get an idea, front view, 3/4 view, and profile. So we can, just by altering the shape and observing how the navel lines up, we can create a different expression, a different angle with the lemon. How about the slices of lemon? So if we look at the profile of the slice of lemon, basically like this. We see a little bit of the half of the navel, that rounded part, and then there's the cut part right across the top here, and this resides on an angle. If we turn that a bit so that it's more like this, let's draw that line first. We'll bring this one sort of in front of this, about the same height. And we put a little bit of the navel here, a little bit back here. We have that slice turning. If that slice is turned all the way, let's make it, well, let's do one more. Let's make this even steeper, a steep foreshortening. Okay, what are we noticing here? The height remains consistent in all three slices, but the distance between end to end, end to end, end to end gets shorter and shorter. Here we're going to start to see a little bit of the front. We still see a little bit of that navel. We see a little more of the navel here, perhaps. Can you see how it's progressing? If I erase this, maybe it's a little clearer. One is coming in front of the other. And they're starting to turn even more. This is foreshortening. So the length is going from approximately 2 inches, maybe 1.5 inches here, and here just about 1 inch. So the distance between gets shorter and shorter as we foreshorten an object. It's the same slice, it's just turning in space. It's the same lemon, it's just turning in space. And so being able to be aware of what's happening helps you to create something that's believable, that looks realistic. And we're going to pursue that idea today in our drawing. So we're kind of warmed up, we've done some sketches. Let's realize these are just outlines at this point. We haven't done any shading. We haven't played with the light at all, except in recording the angle of the shadow. We're just playing with how the shape becomes distorted, progressively distorted when we're turning it. Or if we cut it and manipulate the two halves as we have. There's a distortion there also. This distortion actually creates some interest, creates visual interest. So seeing the lemon like this is actually kind of boring. It's a little too perfect. When we start to distort it like this, it becomes more interesting. Same with the slices. When we start to distort it, turn it in space, I feel it starts to look a little more interesting. It becomes more difficult for us to render, but it does look more interesting. Let's move on. Okay, so I've turned the page and I'm going to do a composition based on the fruit. I'm posting the image so you can see what I'm looking at. And I'm looking to arrange that. I'm going to square this off a little bit. And start to render with the big shapes first. That grapefruit here. I'm using a 2B pencil, and you notice I'm holding it by the back. This gives me a little bit of control. I feel it gives me a little more control. That's why I do it this way. Put the lemon about here. When you place the larger shape first, you can relate these smaller shapes a little more easily. And we want to get our cut fruit as well, the grapefruit as well. So I'm placing that. It's just slightly lower in the picture plane. This is a little bigger, more of an open circle. Making this back grapefruit a little larger, just to sort of give a little weight or anchor to the still life. Okay, not too bad. This has a sort of angle to it. This top has a sort of angle to it. These are all invisibles. There's an angle to the lemon. Let's start with the sliced fruit. Okay, so we have a little slice here. We'll draw it lightly so we can make corrections if we need to. Another slice here. You notice I start with the angle of the top of the slice. This one's a little more foreshortened, not quite as long as this one. A little more foreshortened. And then we have one coming towards us. This one is very foreshortened. Start with that angle. Made these just a little big, so I'm shrinking them slightly. And I'm going to adjust this just to make it a little more interesting. Overlapping is always good for creating interest. Okay, so we have our objects drawn as lines. We do have a cloth running across here. We have the back of the table, should we want to include that. Let's draw some shadows. Light is coming from this left side direction. Shadow. Here the shadow is actually cast on our grapefruit. These shadows, rather skinny. And this shadow is going off. Like so. So I'm looking for the kind of repeated angle. Okay. I like the overlapping, as I say. I like to feel like things are a little bit random, not too organized, as though I just kind of let them fall out of a basket and they're there on the table. Have a variety of directions, a sort of connection for the composition, and we might extend that upwards, either with a fold or a shadow. So the next step, once we have our composition plotted, we look at it and see if we need to make any sort of corrections, check our foreshortening, a little longer, about as long as this lemon. They should feel like they're from the same fruit. The grapefruit, back here another grapefruit, and open-faced here. We do see part of that rind, not a lot. This is a difficult part here. Okay. At this point, I'm going to lighten some of the lines and then start to take my pencil and shade these objects to make them look like light is falling across them, deepen the shadows, build up some edges and some contrast. All right, we're back. I'm just going to take this kneaded eraser. Not in very good shape, but I'll use the white eraser. It's in better shape. And I'm just going to lightly erase some of those lines so I can see I don't need these directional lines anymore. They help me to establish the shape, but we don't need them to create the shading. So I erase those. And we'll start. We could start anywhere. I think I'm going to start towards the back here. Just try to get this shape a little better. Now I've switched to a softer pencil also. Which will allow me to go dark as I wish. So I'm going to start just by using the side of the pencil, start to build up the tone, the light and dark quality of the fruit. The fruit is yellow, which means it's a lighter value, especially where the light is kind of striking the grapefruit. It's just a little brighter through here. You notice that all my strokes are kind of going one direction. There's so many ways to do this. I'm showing you one way today. We'll investigate some other ways as we go on through the course, but this is a simple way of shading rather quickly. And I'm going to do the same on the lemon. With these two are very similar in tonality, so for the moment I'm just going to carry that same tone and leave a little highlight right through here where it's a little brighter on the lemon. But for now I'm going to keep them very similar in tone, almost join them. We can always separate them later. How about our slices? Now the slices are each facing a little different direction. For example, this slice is probably the darkest. Let's just be very general and shade this slice in. This slice is slightly lighter because it's facing the light a little more directly. A little darker. And this slice is very light on this side, darker as it comes to the rind. So we're starting to actually talk and distinguish about light and dark. There's a subtle modulation here. If they look similar at this stage, it's okay. This grapefruit back here, just an extension of this basically. I do notice that it's quite dark on top, and I'm going to make it slightly darker, but not a lot darker at this stage. My main goal is to sort of get the general feeling, shade in my subject somewhat, and later on come back and add darks or take the eraser and pull out some lights. I'm even going to add some of the shadows at this point because I want to see how it looks when it's connected. Just a little bit. You notice that it kind of makes the shape of a Z. This is very much a compositional thought. There's a connection between everything. There's a connection even between the left and the right of the paper. This builds a sort of integrity into your composition. And maybe, as another compositional idea, we even extend that darkness somewhat up to the top of the drawing via a little bit of shadow in the cloth. Something like this. So this is sort of a ghost image. In fact, it is called a ghost image when we do something very broadly with a light tone. And the artist does this to get a sensation of the totality, the placement, the proportion, the connection, the movement. When we state it in this simple single tone, we get that feeling. And the subject starts to emerge. We can see it starting to emerge from the paper. There's, even at this early flat stage, there's a bit of movement to it. I haven't decided what to do here. I'm just going to play with that a little bit to see about another shadow on the wall. All right, so let's return now to the big shape here, this big circle. And let's start to define that. Define it where we notice a darkness, a strong darkness, on the bottom edge. You notice now that I'm using the tip of the pencil a little more. I'm going to continue to build that. Sometimes using the side, sometimes using the tip. Generally, when I want a really strong definition, I'll move to the tip. The tip gives you precision. It also allows you to kind of get a hard edge. Since this is a round object, the edge is always turning. It's a softer edge. Starting to get a little round. I'm distorting that circle a little bit as I shade it to make it a little boxier. Gives the grapefruit a little more character. Starting to have some weight also. I notice all the little cuts and bruises and dents. I'm avoiding those. I will do something with the navel up here. Let's just indicate it for now. We'll come back towards the end when we want to place our details. But for now, just a little idea of that navel is enough. I'm going to start to build in the shadow of the lemon. See, when I bear down on that tip, I can get some precision. Sometimes I need to see it, and then I can build up the tone accordingly. Trying to establish that axis. Preserve that axis. Even though we're shading, it's important to kind of preserve that axis. I'm going to bring the shadow a little lower here. Build up the dark, build up the dark. Okay. So sometimes you see me doing a hatching stroke like this, sometimes a rounded stroke. Basically, as we add more and more graphite to the drawing, we can smooth it out, and we can smooth it out by rounding it or by doing a crosshatch. I'll explain a little more what a crosshatch is as we get further into our series. Okay, let's start with our lemon, and let's go to the darker one first. And we can use a little definition. Back here. That here. And I'm going to make this side of lemon the darkest side. This one, very foreshortened. And this one is bright, but slightly darker than this one. So I'm trying to think in terms of three, not only three different positions or shapes, but three different tonalities. That makes it also feel like it's turning a bit. Here we see a bit of the rind. Here we see a lot of the rind. Here we see a little bit underneath. Nothing on the side though. I'm going to just go ahead and carry this shadow behind the grapefruit, or behind the slice of lemon. Make it jump out a little bit. I might even drop the grapefruit down a little bit to use light and dark to make this come forward. All right, let's not overdo it. Let's connect these shadows. These shadows are quite dark, especially where our lemon is touching the ground, touching the cloth. That point, there's hardly any light reaching that point, so it's going to be very dark where there's contact. You'll hear the sirens now and then. It's because I'm right in downtown Boston. There's always some sort of happening. But I'm innocent. You don't have to worry about me. I need to sharpen the pencil again. Okay. This is the pulp. Make that rind feel a little brighter. bit of detail here. You see how lovely these shadows can be, and how they strengthen the movement of light. Okay, let's continue. We'll refine this later. Let's continue in this general manner for a moment. Play with this a little bit. That makes this light glow even more. Okay, let's move to this guy, this grapefruit back here. Very flat top, but very dark. Let's start there. Start to create that dark ruby red grapefruit. So tasty. Can hardly wait for this class to end so I can slice it up and enjoy it. Pre-COVID, I would have divvied up this grapefruit and shared it with all of you, but not now. It's all mine. And then we'll get this front one. Find our center. Actually, the center should be lighter, shouldn't it? Oh well, we'll correct that. Always times for corrections. Look at how I'm shading this. Sort of like a sunburst. The texture of the grapefruit is fascinating when it's cut open like this, because it looks like you can see the veining and the interesting textures that are created. This is one way to evoke those, is just by letting your pencil stroke start to record those. And we also need the sort of segmentation that happens. So my shading is doing a couple things. One is it's establishing that dark color of the grapefruit. The second thing is it's sort of creating the white rind. It's not completely white, but it's very bright. So that's my concern in this shading, is kind of capturing that rind, similar to what we did down here. And of course, yes, we go much darker, following the same sort of pattern, the same sort of method to create the dark. with this sort of sunburst stroke. And just keep applying it, putting a little extra pressure on, making it darker, richer. It's one of the darkest spots in the composition. And I'm doing it pretty roughly right now. There's going to be some refinement of this. Let's go a little darker through here. This all becomes part of the shadow. It moves to the left off of the page. That shadow too helps us to define the outer edge of the grapefruit. Going through a lot of lead. Okay. 4B, 6B. I'm using the 6B now. I think I mentioned that. This helps me. So when I went in, I use the point here, come down, and this is an intersection here, so it's a little important. I make it a little darker, especially on the back grapefruit, to push forward the other grapefruit, even if I exaggerate it. Is that about right? Right here. Okay, let's see if we can lift out the center, make it a little brighter there with our kneaded eraser. Would have been better to leave it light from the beginning, but I have to get a fresh one. This one's not going to work. How about this one? Will this work? Let's try it. A little bit, but not so effective. I'll come back to that. Let's reflect on this for a moment. It looks to be going pretty well. The tones have certainly given our objects more of a three-dimensional presence. I'm going to go ahead and kind of connect this tone through the back here. Three-dimensional presence. We feel this plane coming forward a bit. And you notice I've managed to lift out a little bit. I'm just going to approach that with the strong dark. Like this. And I'm going to carry it out. Some detail work. creating the segments. I'm exaggerating it a little bit. We do this a lot in artwork. Exaggerate. It's for clarity. Sometimes our eyes miss something. Sometimes, very often, the camera does strange things. So we can correct that in our drawing. That's what I'm doing now, is I'm making the segments a little stronger, a little more obvious, exaggerating them, so that it's a little clearer, a little more obvious. We can make it vague at any point just by adding some tones. I'm going to go a little darker on the edge of this as well. Here's where it's touching the ground. I want to get a nice dark coming off of that. Okay, starting to feel it. Another dark, strong dark here. In a way, we're sort of polishing the graphite. We're cross-hatching and modulating the tones with different strokes. In a way, it's polishing or smoothing the graphite that we're putting on the paper. They do make a device for this. It's called a talon or a stomp. You can also use your finger to smooth things out. This case, I'm just using the pencil to do that. Most of the time, the strokes that I'm applying are following the surface, whether it's rounded, flat, whatever. I'm just building this up to a finish. I notice a little change back here from where the table meets the cloth, and I like that. There's a little light bounce going on behind there. Okay, let's continue. And this grapefruit too is casting a little bit of shadow to the cloth, not a lot. Very dark where it comes right underneath the grapefruit. As it goes outward, as the shadow moves outward, it lightens quite a bit. Just playing with the shadows that are bouncing back there. Improvising. I'm moving away from the photograph a little bit. Doing my own thing. Okay. This guy's pretty well done, I think, through the front here. Let's get one more edge for our grapefruit. This bottom edge where it meets the surface. Oops. Okay. And let's get a little bit of that navel to some subtle changes up here. Through the front here, I notice a darker shadow, some light bounce on the back of the grapefruit. Light is always bouncing around, even when it's coming from a single source. The white of the cloth is bouncing. These fruits tend to have a shiny skin, a sort of polished skin. They are bouncing as well. So that's what I'm creating now, is a little reflectivity. And I see this in my subject, but I am exaggerating it too, both. And just a little tone through here. I don't want to get too edgy, meaning like a dark, thick line to define my objects, rather sort of a turning line, a graded line that shows that the object is round. We do start with that sort of outline. You remember the beginning of this drawing, we did start with outlines, but we don't see any outlines now. It's all edge against edge. And these edges are turning edges because our objects are round. Let's create the same sort of light bounce in our lemon. We make the highlight a little smaller, and when we make it smaller, it becomes actually more powerful. Okay, another sharpen, and we'll finish up the slices in front. Just want to lighten some part of this rind a little bit. And then I'll come back and start to play with the underside of this. The skin is rather dark, even though it's yellow. I want to make a lot of that contrast if I can. Without getting too dark in the area of the pulp or flesh. A little feeling of the navel. And then the cast shadow, which is very narrow here, but very dark. Just erasing a line back here that will give me a little advantage with the edge of this lemon. Something like that. It's a tricky point where all these things are meeting. Now we come to this one. We pull this one forward by going a little darker on this tip. Excuse me, a little darker in the shadow as well. And pull out just a little bit of light quality to the rind. This is the darker of the slices, so overall it's going to have some darkness to it. Nice crisp edge up on top. And this one. A little darker to get that foreshortened quality. Make that come forward, just a little accent. Darker in the shadow. That about does it. Can we make this a little softer feeling, a little less rough? We could use the finger. I would like to see the edge of that grapefruit just sort of break the shadow a little bit, break it up a little bit. How's that? That looks better, doesn't it? Let's go even darker. Well, I'm at a point where getting a little eye fatigue, and I think I'm going to halt my work on this for the moment. I keep this untouched until I have a moment tomorrow to look at it, in which case I might make some adjustments, clean it up a bit, this sort of thing. Play with it somewhat. But a good start, starting from basic shapes, building up those basic shapes, overlapping those basic shapes, is a good compositional strategy to create depth. We're basically, of course, we're working with 2 dimensions. How can we express 3 dimensions? There's little tricks along the way. One of those tricks is overlapping. When you can overlap things, you start to create a stacking or a feeling of depth to your subject. Another way is through light and dark. We can bring things forward, make things retreat by going light and dark. And edges too. Softer edges tend to retreat. Harder edges tend to come forward, especially when we combine them with a strong dark. Well, simple objects, but still quite complex, still quite challenging. Let's close up shop for the moment.
Well, thank you for watching to the end. I hope you found this content interesting and inspiring. Have a look at the description below to find out more about this project, or click the banner up above to visit my webpage and learn about workshops and in-person classes, as well as other important resources.